I'm asking a question today that may seem not very good to some people. You may want to tune me out. You may think, why would you bring up such a negative thing as that? I understand that. And yet, in 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, we read where Paul is addressing men and women. And he says in verse 12, I permit not a woman to teach, nor to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. I didn't read usurped authority. Some versions may be close to that. But I read the prohibition of a woman that is not to usurp the authority over a man. And that may seem out of step with our culture, and I think it is. I see women, I've addressed women, I've been in meetings in the northern part of the country, and people from the West Coast are coming through that part of the country, and they hear sermons, maybe just a point about the woman in subjection to the man, the husband and wife relationship, that they think that is so old-fashioned. That's out of step with our 21st century culture. I understand that, but is it out of step with God? And was Paul saying that you were not to have that kind of dominion over a man as he addresses the women? Was it based upon his cultural biases? It's the way he's been raised? It's the way men were at that time? Or does he base it upon something that unites the whole Bible together? The reason he says to not do that is, number 1, verse 13, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. That takes me to the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of creation. And he is laying the point about not having dominion over a man because of the primacy of just how he created them. Man first, and then the woman, to be a help suitable to him. That's not cultural bias. It's either a fact or it's a lie. Or it's a lying fact that Paul wanted to talk about. He'll test your faith. The second reason he says for that is not to occur is that Adam was not beguiled, but the woman, being beguiled, hath fallen into transgression. That's the order in which that went too. That's either true or it's just a myth. Paul doesn't base it upon cultural biases or the way the culture is. He bases upon the priority in creation. And what happened when women did take control, they failed in holding to the things of God. She knew what God had required. Don't you eat of that tree. She did it first. She gave it to the man. He's not out of the woods. He tries to be. But I'm impressed with the fact that God makes his points, not on cultural bias, not on cultural things. Paul is not just chained to his culture when he speaks. He speaks an apostle. And he takes us to the beginning of God's book, and God's book is united. It's one whole message. And this is the reason why he's applying it, this one for all delivered faith, to the women of the church in that day. That these are the facts. It started with how God designed men and women. Oh, there's a battle between the sexes today. Oh, there's women that don't need a man, don't want a man, resent any authority that the man has. And there are young girls growing up who are very athletic, and they are realizing that men who are wanting to claim to be a woman, you can change their hormones, but they sure are winning a lot of races. They're setting a lot of women's records. And there is turmoil in the athletic world between women and those men who want to be women. And if you declare it, change your hormones, but they can't change the muscular structure of a boy when he's born as a baby, and they can't change the bone density of a male, that's given them a little bit of edge. How long will the women of our day hold up to that? There's resentment. And you may look at this, and it may tell you where your heart is. You may look at that question, and you may respond this way in our culture. When has she usurped authority? I guess it's whenever a man says so. You may have that attitude. Whatever he says, I guess I have. Or you may be a member of the church and you're tired of hearing this lesson taught. You resent it because deep down it rubs against you the wrong way. To hear what as a woman, I could usurp the authority of the man, and that might tell us where our heart is. But I think I'm speaking to godly women. I know I am. And I may be speaking to a world out there, and I want you to know, if you're not a Christian, you may be a young girl growing up, and you see the battles that are taking place in the sexual relationships, that we as God's people are told in Romans 12 and verse 2, that we're not to be fashioned according to this world, but we're to be transformed. We may have our biases, we may have our backgrounds, but we're to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that may prove what is good and acceptable according to God's will. And God's book unites us. Tonight we read for our reading the glory and the praise of a woman. And her works can praise her in the gates. God honors the woman. He made male and female different for a purpose. They have their roles. And God's book places that harmoniously together. That we ought to thank God for the revelation of His Word. And I'm interested, if I were a woman, when does that happen? Apparently it can. Paul doesn't want it to happen. When does it happen? And I hope that will help us as we live this godly life. We put in the context of how it's written. We've looked at parts of it, giving the two reasons why Paul says what he says. But when you say usurp authority, what does that mean? In fact, there is one English word that would be common. This idea of authority, having authority, the word is over. The word is over a man. And the word that is used as authority over, the Greek word is one Greek word. It means self-work. I'm taking this role on. It is a work that I am doing. I'm standing in the place of something that I'm having dominion over a man. It's not what God would have me to do, but it is something that I'm doing. I'm taking it on myself. Because God doesn't give you authority to do that. And you're not to be involved in that work. You're not to have dominion. We're not to exercise. There's your work concept. A dominion over a man. And that's where we say, well, we need to find out what all that is. And what's connected with this is a participle, present tense. It's always continuing with this prohibition. For he says, not to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. I permit not a woman to teach, nor have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. So not to have dominion is connected with the idea of teaching, is connected with teaching over a man. That was not her role in usurping that place that God has placed man in. That's the context, that's the problem in the church among those people. And we see this. It's dealing with religious worship, religious teaching. Look at the context when you've noticed in verse 9. He's speaking about men that are holding up holy hands in prayer. Men are together. It seems like they have come together. It's the idea of worship and teaching. And he addresses the men as they take that leading role of prayer. They're to hold up holy hands, not hands that are filled with sin, not hands that are filled with hate, not hands that are filled with hypocrisy, but holy hands, separated unto God. They're doing that in prayer. And women are to be paying attention that their self is not being distracting. You're coming there, men are praying, you're not to be distracting them by your ostentatiousness. That's what we see here, because he speaks about the clothing. He says, in like manner, women adorn themselves with modest apparel fit for the occasion. And he says, with shamefastness and sobriety, not with braided hair, gold or pearls, or costly raiment. That bring attention, costly raiment. Sometimes that was not modest. But costly raiment, gold or pearls, and braided hair. Braided hair, I mean, way up here sometime. Ornate. That was a problem of that time. But what was it doing? It's being ostentatious. It's bringing attention to me and my outward appearance. That's not condemning women to look pretty. That's not condemning women for dressing nicely. But it's not fitting for the occasion to come trotting into a congregation, look like a brand new fleeced out poodle. With all the ornate things that you take your poodle to and get fixed up. You're not walking in here like a poodle. Look at me. But that was part of what's taking place. And there's but a woman who is professing godliness through good works. Now look at me, but my works will talk from me. And that quiet spirit, that humble, meek, quiet spirit, we're not going to push the envelope. We're here as godly women, and he is trying to get them to see that ostentation. That's why immodest dress is condemned here. You say, well, this is ostentatious dress. People are ostentatious when they show their nakedness. Same principle is why we need to learn that, especially we're getting into springtime now. Women involved in religious learning. They were to be, not to lead in the teaching, but they were to be involved in learning. That's what he wanted the woman to do. When she took that leading role of teaching, Eve messed up. But she is to be involved in learning. Verse 11, let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection. We get into this word quietness, and there are different words. This word doesn't mean she doesn't speak. It's like in Thessalonians, do your own work with quietness. You want me to work? No, I don't want you meddling in other people's matters. I don't want you going into areas that don't belong to you. And I want you to be quiet, that you're not agitated because of your particular role and how God governs that. Not that you don't speak, but there's to be there to learn in quietness. In verse 14, Adam was not begot, but the woman being begot have fallen into transgression. She needs to sit and learn. We all do, but here's that, taking that role where God has placed the man. And 1 Peter 3 and verse 4, what's precious in the sight of God? What is something that is so valuable? It is that woman with a meek and quiet spirit. And there's our quietness again. Not that she doesn't speak, but she sure doesn't get wordy in trying to convert an unbelieving husband. He sees her character. He sees her works. And in 1 Peter 3, it's something that will cause him to think, and he'll become a Christian too. Beholding, he says, be in subjection to your own husbands, even if they obey not the word, they may without the word be gained by the behavior of their wives. Beholding your chaste behavior coupled with fear. Whose adorning, let it not be the outward adorning of braiding the hair, wearing jewels or gold, or putting on apparel. You have to put on apparel, you'll be naked. So he's not condemning that. but let it be the hidden man of the heart in the incorruptible apparel of a meek. I'm bringing myself under control and quiet about it. I'm not agitated. I'm not going to be meddling things where I don't need to be meddling. That's okay with me. That's the heart of the woman, which is in the sight of God of great price. There's nobody that can be converted to Christ without the Word. He's not teaching that. Without the Word, be converted. But it's that, not the wordiness, but he will come to the Word because that Word is teaching the place that the woman has. It's an honorable place. And in the context, you see why I asked the question. When does a woman usurp that authority that God has placed for a man, and that role for a man to have? Men need to step up to it, not be begged to it. Godly men understand that, and they treat their wife the way they should. We talked about that in lessons not too long ago. But here is, in connection with religious teaching, in connection with women that are in the presence of men, they have to be very careful not to usurp that authority. Self-work. I'm going to put myself into that place. Hope is a concept that we have. Women are being submission to their husband. And we begin to see that order that God has placed. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, the Apostle Paul says, I would have you know that the head of every man, and in this context it's going to be the male, head of every man is Christ. And the head of the woman is the man. And the head of Christ is God. Christ, he's in submission to the Father. Does that make him second-class citizen? No, they're equal to one another. But in that role of headship, we'll find that indeed Jesus is heeding the will of the Father. And one day he's going to return the kingdom that he's ruling over back to the Father. And he will be in that role once again. There's nothing demeaning about it. It's order in which God has set things. And over man, we see that indeed Christ is over man, and the head of the woman is the man. That's God ordained. That's the way he designed it. We see that thus saith the law, says that. In 1 Corinthians, the 14th chapter, verses 34 and 35, in another context of gathering together, exercising miraculous spiritual gifts, it's a time for learning and worship. Let the woman keep silence. That word means don't speak. Let the woman keep silence in the churches, for it's not permitted unto her to speak, but let them be in subjection, as also saith the law. Genesis 3:16, that's the way God had designed that. And what we see in verse 28 and 30 is that in this context, there is the silence. Not that I don't have a spirit that wants to meddle in areas I don't need to be, agitated all the time because of that role restriction. But here was the context of being silent. She's not to speak, as we see in verse 34. Well, what's the context? Verse 28, if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church. Here's a man that has that gift of tongues to present a message in a tongue that he's never learned. He doesn't know. And if there's no one else to interpret, see, God is, well, I'll say it and I'll interpret it for you. Had someone else with that gift of interpretation. If the person is not there, you don't talk. You keep silent. Let him speak to himself and to God. Let the prophets speak by two or three, and let the others discern. But if a revelation be made to another sitting by, let the first keep silence. That means don't speak. They go in order. There's an orderly arrangement. And so we see if that's the case, is he saying that about the women? Yes, but notice we're talking about wives of the prophets. How do you know that? Because here's a context where you can imagine that you're married to a prophet and he has a revelation from God and you want to know what that is. Is that the context that we're looking at here? I think so. Because in verse 35, if the wives of the prophets learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. That's why I say that. It is shameful for a woman to speak in the church in this context. That's disrupting things. You can find out from your husband, who is a prophet, what it means if you have questions about it. Because in this role, they were not to take that role of leading the discussion about how things in the presence of the men in these assemblies. There's that honoring that place of man. The wife is to be submissive to her husband and submit unto him, which is fitting in the Lord, in Colossians 3 and verse 18. In fact, Ephesians 5:22, she's being subjection to her husband as unto the Lord. Verse 24, in everything. He takes the leading role. That's his work as a head of the house. I'm okay with that as a woman. Okay with that. I know my place. And there is that submission to a husband. Honor it like Sarah honored her role with her husband in 1 Peter 3, 1 through 2 and 5 and 6. And what's interesting, this is being married to a non-Christian. This is being married to a man that hasn't become a Christian yet. She still honors him. She still submits unto him in everything, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. He's the master. So we begin to realize that God has placed this in a marriage relationship. There's this submission that is there. The godly woman is okay with that. She brings her talents, she brings her abilities to the marriage. But she realizes he takes that leading role, and she honors that. There's the unity between the sexes that God has allowed, recognizing our differences and recognizing how God would have us to act. So let's get to the application. When has a woman usurped that authority? I think rightly so, that a woman is doing so when teaching or preaching God's instruction to audiences of men in public assemblies. That doesn't mean you can go to the private assembly and get out of line. I'm just saying that's the context. And that's what Paul is talking about in 1 Timothy 2:12. That here you need to learn and listen. That role is for the men. They're there, you know. They're the ones leading in prayer. They're to be leading in this. In the public assemblies. A woman was not to be taking that role. That's definitely there. And what? It's clear. Why come we have women preachers today? Women pastors. Not only that's reserved for men to be married to one wife, but it's used in the religious world as that's the preacher. Who's your pastor? He runs this church. He's the pastor. He's the evangelist. Standing up and preaching. And our culture, our young people have been conditioned. You can see it on television. I've been in congregations of the denominational world. I've been in congregation of the liberal churches of Christ, and they have no problem with that now. It didn't take long for that to get into culture out here, to get into so-called people that are trying to follow the New Testament. But this is definitely taking that role that God hasn't placed her in. She's bringing herself into an area that God talked to men. I think she's done that. But a woman is not usurping authority when she sings to one another in public assemblies. How's that over a man? She's joining in the singing of men and women. She's not saying, I want to do a solo, even though women's voices will be going when men's voices are going. But Ephesians 5:19, there's not the limitation But how do you speak to one another if you're not in a public gathering? If you're not with another? Is this something private that you do with one worker and you sing psalms and hymns to that person? Just one person? It's not a public gathering? I think it's a public gathering. We speak to one another. In psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, we're teaching. We are admonishing. And in that public assembly, well, a woman is to be quiet in the church. No, the wives were to be, who were married to the prophets. They could talk to their husbands at home to learn. But this was enjoined upon all of us. Well, she's talking, therefore she's out of subjection? No. Because the participle is over a man, and she's singing with the men. A woman is not usurping authority when she's accompanying her husband to give religious instruction to a man. 1 Timothy 2:12 was teaching, having dominion over a man, teaching over a man. But here she's in the presence of at least two men, her husband, and maybe a man. And we see an example of that in Acts the 18th chapter. When Priscilla, her name is mentioned first, by the way, and Aquila, they hear Apollos preach. And in verse 26 it says, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more accurately. Oh, he did it. No, they did it. That's what it says. Wow, there's your teaching combo. That's your husband and wife teaching combo. And we have a Bible authority. We can start having our classes, our public classes with men in it, and we'll have a woman and a man, and we are combining our effort. We're not usurping authority. Some churches are doing that. What happens when the husband gets the flu? She's teaching a bunch of men that day until she catches it. What happens when he's gone? Oh, I'm still teaching. Because we're a team. Well, the team's gone. What are you? You're a woman. What are they? They're not your husband. He's home with the flu. Those are all the men in the congregation. But we do have an example. I wonder how that looked. She's given information along with her husband. She's not teaching over the man. She's teaching to the man in the sense of recognizing the authority of her husband. She could chime in and talk. She had a part in this teaching. And it's how you go about it sometimes. Whether you are usurping authority or not. But to be teaching a man in the presence of your husband can be done without usurping authority. When does a woman usurp authority? What about a single woman? She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't necessarily have a man that goes with her to go teach others. But she has someone at work and said, what do you believe about that? Is she to be silent? 1 Peter 3:15 is not just limited to men, but it's limited to all of us, male and female. There's nothing there to limit that in that context. Sanctifying your hearts, Christ is Lord, being ready always to give answer to every man that asketh you a reason concerning the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. They're asking you something. They're asking for help and maybe a religious question. Well, I can't say anything, but I'll go get my preacher. Well, that's fine. I can't say anything, but here's a tract. Hope it's not written by a woman. Oh, it's a man tract, and that's all I can do. Well, sometimes there's a need for at that moment to give instruction. Just offering an answer to a question a man asks you. What if you're a single woman? You can be very effective in the workplace without taking that role of teaching and having dominion over a man. I think you can give that information and do so in a respectful way and serve the Lord in the way that you should. What about a woman who's teaching high school or college secular subjects to males? We're getting out of the context of the assemblies. We're getting even out of the context of religious instruction. And we see a reality, you know, our wives, our mothers, our daughters, they're teaching in public schools. And some have the ability to teach in higher education. Are they usurping authority over a man when they respect men and they're giving secular instruction? We've taken it out of its context of 1 Timothy 2, if we believe that. I don't think she's doing that at that occasion as well. And a woman is not because she runs her own business, may have to be given instruction to males. That's not necessarily making her out of her place. In 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, 9 through 14, we see that's in the context of religious teaching in the assemblies there. And she's not to do that, but in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 14, in a context of the widows. There'll be young widows, and he wants them to get married. But there'll be the older widows, which he says 60 and above, that could be helped by the church. But in verse 14, it's our desire, therefore, the younger widows to marry, bear children, rule the household. Whoa, no. You've been talking about the role of the man. He's head of this house. That's true. And with your finger there, and you go to 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, and when he speaks about the qualifications of elders, and in verse 4, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children subjection with all gravity. I got in my Bible, ruling well his own house, but they're two different Greek words. The word here instructing the elder and the qualifications of an elder, he stands in front. He leads from in front. He's ruling his household. He's standing in front of his children, being an example to them how they should go. He's standing in front of his wife, tenderly bringing her along in the direction that she should go. In that sense, he's managing, he's ruling his house because he's leading. That's the place for the man, leading in the family. But the word in 1 Timothy 5 means I'm overseeing the household. That could be done with the husband leading. She can be managing things well at home too. That's what he says to do. They don't contradict one another. They accommodate one. What a wonderful relationship. When two godly people get a hold of this, that's what the man is to be doing. If she can use her talents in managing that household, that helps the husband. Wasn't she created to be a help, suitable to him? Now, Adam could have trained some dogs to go fetch things and get things and that sort of thing. But that's not a woman. That's been created in the image of God. And God provided that for the man. And what a wonderful role she's taking when she can be involved in helping. She'll have to give instructions. We have an example in Acts the 16th chapter. In verses 14 and 15, where here's a woman that was a businessman. Did she quit her business because she became a Christian? She couldn't take a role as CEO of her purple dyeing business. There's not indication that takes place here. Lydia was a seller of purple in the city of Thyatira. The Lord opened her heart in verse 14. She is baptized in verse 15. And she turned the business over to men because she can't rule. She can't have dominion over men. Didn't say that. But she was baptized in her household. She besought us, saying, if ye have judged us to be faithful, or me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. She had household people. Now, they weren't babies because they were baptized. But they could have been servants. In her business, she's going to encounter men. She's probably going to have to give instruction to males. Is she overstepping her bounds? I don't think so. We read in Proverbs, the 31st chapter, where the woman is praised. Oh, she may have been beautiful, but that is fleeting. She trusts in the Lord. She looks after her household well. Look at all she does. She sells things. She plants a garden. She plants things. Her work is profitable. And the very last verse says, her works will praise her in the gates. Her works will praise her in the gates. And there's the women using her talents in the context of her household. And she is ruling her household according to God. She's managing it well. What a blessing to the husband when that occurs. Women, you ought to be encouraged, even though there's a different role. Men have their place of taking that lead. You don't want that. When you have a husband that takes that lead, that's a blessing to you. And a loving head at that, who's looking out for your well-being. But women ought to be encouraged, because we read in the Bible that there were women who served the Lord and served the church. Romans 16, 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul speaks of Phoebe. She may need some help, brethren. You people are wrong. As you come there, you help her. Why should we, Paul? Receive her in the Lord, worthy of the saints, that you assist her in whatever matters she may have need of you. For she herself also hath been a helper of many, Paul included. Paul own self. She helped me. I don't know how she helped him. Did he get up her outlines? His outlines? I don't think so. He's inspired of God. Was she a team teacher? Was she a pastor? She's a servant. Did that make her a deacon? She's a servant. And there was roles for deacons who were to be husbands, having wives and so forth, their own wife and so forth. But this is a servant doing so many things that help Paul as he would be journeying, needing certain things. There would be Phoebe there to help her, as well as the church being there to help. Euodia and Syntyche, they got a little problem. They're not getting along. In Philippians, the 4th chapter and verse 2, he writes, true yoke fellow, you're engaged in this. I exhort Euodia and I exhort Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Apparently, they weren't of the same mind in the Lord. I beseech thee also, true yoke fellow, help these women. Why? For they labor with me in the gospel. Well, they weren't tag team preachers, but they labored in the gospel. Maybe helping his needs, as we'll see in 3 John 6 through 8. And with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. They're workers. They're not complainers. They're busy doing work that they're assigned to do, that they're equipped to do, and they're using those abilities. And we become fellow workers when we might not be preaching the gospel as the Apostle Paul or John, but we see in verse of 3 John, pick up with verse 7, because that for the sake of thy name they went forth asking nothing of the Gentiles. We need to help them because they're not getting anything from the Gentiles. So the gospel will not be tarnished and say, well, they're only doing that for money. You help them. We therefore ought to welcome such, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. You help spread the gospel, dear godly woman, with your funds, with your word of mouth, with your encouragement on Facebook, with the idea of encouraging the preaching, wanting people to hear sermons, encouraging. You help the church, you help the preacher. That's something you can do, but you're not teaching over a man, usurping that authority that God has said that's not for what you to do. What's this woman doing in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 10? She's professing godliness through good works. So she honors her role. She stops at what God prohibits her to do. She's quiet about it. And she embraces what she can do. And what we find in Scripture, she's filling her time, not what she can't do, but she's filling her time of what she can do. And we see this woman in 1 Timothy 5:10. We see the younger widows. He wanted them to marry, bear children, rule the household. But here's looking back on these women. They don't have anybody to help them. And they are well reported of good works. If she brought up children, if she hath used hospitality to strangers, that is a role a woman does very well. I remember a few years ago I was with an older preacher who had to remain a bachelor in most of his later years. Most of it. It's all of his later years. He had to be a bachelor. He had lady friends, but he also was a bachelor. And when I stayed in meetings with him, we were two bachelors that week. And the touch of a woman was not around there until Sunday potluck. And the doors were open. Women of that church came in, and they would provide the food. They would provide the things that made things look pretty that I didn't see all week. And it had that touch. And they worked well with this bachelor older preacher. And they fulfilled their role. They helped him. They helped the work. They were given to hospitality to strangers. If she has washed the saints' feet, that was reserved for servants. She's been there. That's something she could do, and she would do that. The saints' feet. Oh, we're one in Christ. There's no male or female. There's no bond free. There's no Jew and Gentile. You're a saint. I'll humble myself and wash your feet. Because that's needed when you're in your sandals and you don't have a car to get into. You're in your sandals and you're walking those dusty roads. That was something that was needed. That was something that was fulfilled. And she showed that kind of humility, but taking care of the needs. Do you like to have clean feet? If she hath relieved the afflicted, if she diligently followed every good work. There's work that can be done, and women sometimes are well fitted for that. And we need to be thinking, what can I do if we're women? But there is indeed a role, there's indeed a line that we do not want to cross, because we want to be transformed by the renewing of our mind and realize, God, your wisdom is great. I want to have a house like that. I want to have a family like that. I want to be a husband that honors a woman like this. And I want to be a woman who honors her husband like this and serves others and serves the church. And to fill your life with good works is the way God would have us to be. Yes, we can usurp authority over a man, women. But there's so much that we can do. And let's understand our role and embrace it and use it all to God's glory. Those of you who are not a member of the Lord's church, those of you who don't claim to be Christians, those of you who have never obeyed the gospel, I talk to you now, that we speak about a family relationship of how it can be, and that can be that way. But we're interested in every precious soul. And we may be married to godly spouses, but we're not a Christian. You look at their lives. If they're living like that, you should. Why do they live like that? Because you look around the world, in our society, that's not what you see. You'll be happy you have a spouse that's trying to live this way. The point is, what about your soul? Your soul is precious. And one day we'll all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and our wives are not going to answer for us, and our husbands are not going to answer for us. We will give an answer what we've done in the body. You're in the body right now. And this afternoon you may leave it, or you may stay here for a number of years. But one day we will meet the Lord. You know, it's been a great song, Someday Never Comes, and there's a reason for that. Someday never comes because all of a sudden it's today. It's not someday, it's today. And that day's coming. And we want you to be prepared to meet your Lord. He loved you. He gave himself up for you. He was raised to give you the confidence, raised from the dead, to give you confidence that you can be powerful over your enemy, which is death. And realize that you can have your soul saved and you could be prepared to go to heaven when he comes for the resurrection. Why not live like that, realizing, hey, when I put this, transforming my mind and following God's wisdom, I'm not only going to have a good family, I'm going to have a good eternity. We offer that to you. Obey the gospel as we stand and sing.